Welcome to today's presentation, Reduce Audit Pain with Continuous Compliance, how Chef helps financial institutions move faster while maintaining audit readiness. Let's go ahead and get started. Dan, why don't you kick us off?
Okay, thanks, April, and thanks everyone for joining and spending part of your day with us today. As April mentioned, I'm Dan Hauenstein, responsible for product marketing at Chef. And joining me today is Ricardo Lupo. So, hi, Lupo.
Hi, Dan.
Excellent. So today we're going to talk about a particularly exciting subject for everyone, and that's audits. The good news is we're going to talk about how to reduce the pain associated with audits, and we're going to talk a little bit about financial institutions and talk about the specific pains that you experience around audits and how to address those. We'll take you through an approach to achieve what we call continuous compliance. We'll even get into some detail around how to express FFIEC controls as code in InSpec, so you can continuously test and validate that compliance. And ideally, that'll help take away all that pain that audits cause. So let's jump into it. All right, on the financial services side, there are a number of pressures that really make it challenging these days to serve customers better and ultimately grow the business. Competition, while always intense with traditional competitors, today comes from many new directions. There are fintech companies, adjacent players that are moving into the space. There's so much disruption today that you have analysts like Gartner out there predicting that 80% of what they refer to as heritage firms will go out of business or become marginalized. Now, controlling costs has begun to take center stage again. Forrester predicts that broad budget cuts will come in 2019 due to margin pressure. And regulatory change, meanwhile, is keeping everyone on their toes, particularly those with operations that cross international borders. The rate of change in the regulatory space, the challenge with keeping up with new regulations make it the #1 concern for corporate compliance officers in the US, and that's according to Thomson Reuters. Then, of course, there's the specter of cyber attacks that hangs over everything. Accenture estimates cybercrime is more expensive for the financial services sector than any other, with costs increasing by 40% over 3 years to a total of over 18 million per firm on average. So how do we respond to these pressures? Well, to deal with security and regulations, we conduct audits. And as these threats increase and regulations change, what do? We conduct more audits. Well, who loves an audit? Ricardo, you've spent a lot of time with financial institutions during your career. You spent a lot of time with our customer base. What's the typical reaction you hear from people when it comes to audits? Do you find people who love audits?
I have yet to find somebody who is raising their hand willingly to actually go through an audit. And having done audits both as a customer in financial services as well as working with our customers now around our compliance platform, I can tell you that audits are very painful, they're very time-consuming, and I can even give you an anecdote from my prior life in financial services where we had quarterly audits, and so we prepared for those on the regular because those were known. And then we had a series of unscheduled, unsolicited audits where we had to go and, frankly, scurry around, stop what we were doing, and go and actually provide evidence for those audits. So not only were they time-consuming, you were under the gun, and they weren't. It wasn't the best working environment to have to go through all of those audit exercises.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I think so. We all agree. They're painful. We don't like audits. Unfortunately, as you look at this, as the regulatory scope change, complexity increases on one dimension, and technology scope and complexity is growing on the other, that pain is increasing. So audits are already quite time-consuming, as you mentioned. They're pulling skilled people off of teams to go and work on audits instead of their value-delivering projects. They're stressful. You've got internal audit teams who feel like they can't trust the answers they're getting. You've got IT teams who feel like they're being put in a trap. They're trying to be caught rather than just helped by the auditors. and they're overwhelming. We talked about cloud scale, increasing regulations, driving those data needs ever upward. So this entire approach is unsustainable. The traditional way we bring technology to production really doesn't help either. So typically those security scans are done at the end. It's a gate before you go into production. Those checks are done by a security team that hasn't been involved in some of the earlier stages of the process. So something gets thrown over the wall. They'll use a scanning tool to inspect. That generates a lot of data. It's a lot of false positives to sift through. I'm sure people are used to seeing these issues that they become messy, but it also is so late in the process that you have to go back and do a lot of expensive rework. On top of that, you have exceptions that aren't managed, that aren't tracked. So this process ends up returning a lot of irrelevant findings that end up cropping up again and again in audits later on. Another issue is, even though we're using these painstaking audits to be absolutely sure we're not at risk, the reality is we really don't know what our compliance stance is in between these audits. It more likely follows the pattern on the right than the one on the left, where compliance levels fall off pretty quickly after a whole lot of work has been done around an audit. And then there's another flurry of activity to get you ready for the next audit to bring it back up again. So all that time between audits, when the visibility is limited like this, represents windows of risk that are unacceptable for any institution. Another issue, there's a big challenge associated with audits, and that is they involve people. And these people have different goals, they have different skills, different tools, different mechanisms for how they communicate. Compliance teams generally know regulatory policies. They work with a lot of documents. Security teams, they really understand the vulnerability landscape, how to test for those. They're typically not working with code, however. And then DevOps teams may be working with code, but they probably don't go very deep on compliance requirements. So this all creates an environment where there are a lot of opportunities for misunderstandings, for ambiguity, and ultimately for mistakes as well. So what should we do about all of this? Our perspective is manage compliance as code. Now, code addresses each of those things that I outlined. Scalability, you can apply code across that whole sprawl of growing complexity. It also allows you to shift testing left in the process and fix those mistakes much earlier when it's inexpensive to do so. With that continuous visibility that you can get from code, you can eliminate those windows of risk that we showed on the previous slide. And inherently, code is a collaboration mechanism. It's a common language. People review code. It's unambiguous as well. So it does just what it says it will. Ultimately, code is what enables this continuous compliance, which we see this as a way to make it much easier to satisfy the requests that you get from auditors anytime you get those requests. It also drives greater speed and lower risk throughout the operation because you can fix those compliance issues long before they get to production. Now, this bar graph at the bottom, love this graph. This illustrates the audit cycle time improvements from a major healthcare organization using Chef technology. It's kind of a ridiculous looking bar chart, but it is really just an illustration of the difference between manual processes and automated processes. So 90+% improvement is something we've seen across a number of our customers. Okay, all right, so with that, I'm sure you're wondering how you too can achieve 95% improvement in a key metric. So I'm gonna pass it over to Ricardo from here to take you into some depth around how to use InSpec in the FFIEC compliance context.
Excellent. Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Yeah, so let's go through and actually talk through how we would map a particular compliance regime, in this case, the FFIEC example, to InSpec. And so you saw some examples earlier, but InSpec is Chef's compliance as code framework. And so there's a couple of different things we want to keep in mind when it comes to FFIEC. So FFIEC is one of the latest examples, and while it's fairly new, it's not really any different from other compliance regimes that are out there, say like a PCI, a HIPAA, or SOX. Essentially, it prescribes uniform principles, standards, and report forms for federal examination of financial institutions, and it's responsible for developing those uniform reporting systems for those supervised financial institutions, their holding companies, and the non-financial institution subsidiaries. So it's a very broad reach and a broad kind of set of directives from this mandate. Now, what's really interesting is the CIS, or the Centers of Internet Security Benchmarks, can be used as a basis for FFIEC compliance policy. So CIS, if you're not aware, has a very defined set of controls in terms of how you should define your compliance and security on your systems. The big thing that we want to keep in mind here is that customization is always going to be necessary. I've worked in a large financial institution. We were a SOX shop, quote unquote, but we had a superset of those regulations that we define as part of our financial services organization. So that customization is always going to be necessary because there are going to be exceptions and interpretations that you're going to have to keep in mind. And one of the real powers of the InSpec language and the Chef compliance framework is your ability to actually leverage what we call inheritance to be able to ensure that you can take the best practices or the things that are defined from, say, a CIS requirement, and then modify the controls that are pertinent or that have been defined by your organization into an artifact that is compliance as code. Okay? And so mapping out these CIS security controls, we can see that CIS publishes a mapping by regime from CIS benchmark rules to relevant sections of the regime. Your regimes are along the top. Your CIS benchmark categories are the rows. A little bit of a fidelity issue with this bitmap, but we do have a reference link for everyone to actually go and look at this in more detail. But you'll see the column that's highlighted in the orange. That is specific to the FFIEC regime and how the CIS benchmarks map to that regime. So Dan mentioned earlier, one of the kind of core tenets and principles around InSpec and Chef compliance is that it is unambiguous. And so part of that clarity, right, to remove the ambiguity, is allowing you to use a common language. So we take ambiguous requirements typically defined in a compliance regime, and if you look at those actors that Dan also spoke about, you would usually have your compliance officers. They're typically working off of Word documents, spreadsheets, PDFs, websites, et cetera. So kind of really high-level language, which really doesn't apply to systems. And so we take those ambiguous requirements and we allow you to translate those to tests that describe the requirements unambiguously. Take the real-life ambiguous statement on the left, very open to interpretation. So, for example, does this statement apply to all environments or just production? What mandatory access control system should we use? What does enabled mean? Many of these mandatory access control systems have several modes of operating. For example, the common one on Red Hat is called SE Linux and can be run in permissive mode or enforcing mode. If we're in enforcing mode, what level are we enforcing? SE Linux typically has 4 levels. We won't go in the 4 levels, but we want to make sure that we're actually very clear about which level we want to describe our compliance. So those are just a couple of simple examples of ambiguity. Now, if you take the complexity issue, Dan also mentioned earlier around audits, your surface for audits is increasing. So back 10 years ago, we had very limited targets in terms of managing. We were typically managing assets on-premise and on-premise data center. And now with the advent of cloud, APIs, services, there are so many different dimensions to the compliance aspect and the auditing aspect of it all that just makes it much more difficult to work in this unambiguous way. And you can see why it would become an issue. So let's take a requirement from the FFIEC for host security. So, for example, and again, these are not exhaustive. They're just clearly meant to be examples. We want to take that requirement which defines host security, and we want to actually make it into unambiguous code using InSpec. So you'll see here, this is an actual InSpec code example that actually defines that the bootloader password needs to be set on your host. And so you can clearly see the control name, the title, a clear text description, tagging, and impact. This is super important when we start to want to translate those unambiguous statements that are in our compliance handbooks and whatnot into code. And what we can see here is that we've got the best of both worlds. We have code that actually acts on a system. So you see at the bottom 3 or 4 lines, you'll see that I'm actually introspecting a particular file that has this bootloader password setting. Okay, and you can see what we're doing is we're actually testing to ensure it has the valid settings. Higher up in that code, we're actually describing exactly what the compliance rule is supposed to be. And so anyone can read this code and clearly understand what it's meant to do. And this is really important as we start to talk about those really, really ineffective handoffs between your compliance teams, your security teams, and your development and operations teams. Having these things in code becomes clearer. It becomes a thing that you can actually reason about, and it's something you can actually run on your systems. Which again, here before that, you really had a challenge because you had to literally translate what was being said in a document to what was actually happening on a system. Here's another example around restricting OS access. And so this is a popular one for most operators out there that want to restrict access to the operating system. They want to restrict access to the SU or super user command. Again, you can see here, I've got clarity in terms of what I'm actually defining. So I'm actually defining the rule, what the title of that rule is, the description, its impact, and tagging as well. So I didn't mention before, but here we have some metadata that allows us to tag the rules to be very specific in terms of what types of assets this profile affects. So in this case, this affects servers and workstations, its level, as well as its impact, which also, again, from an auditor's perspective, is clear in terms of the contract you're making with your compliance teams and your auditors to understand, hey, this is a critical impact setting that I need to make sure is running on my system. So this is probably the most important piece of content out there in terms of what we do as a compliance as code framework, and its inheritance. And so the idea there is that you have the benchmarks that are out there, and so Chef supports many of the CIS benchmarks for a wide variety of platforms, whether it's Red Hat, Ubuntu, Windows. We also support things like integrations with cloud providers to actually introspect via service accounts through APIs to ensure that we have compliance there as well. But ultimately, the idea is we have a rich set of content around those benchmarks. I mentioned earlier, most organizations will look to have a superset of compliance rules that are defined for their organization. And what you can do is you can easily inherit the controls that you want from the CIS baselines and define those as your superset and as your kind of empirical authority around what your compliance regime looks like for your organization. So you can see here in this example, I'm essentially inheriting controls from the CIS Rel 7 Level 1 server benchmark, and I'm defining a set of controls that I want to include as part of me being the customer, my set of compliance requirements, and I'm defining all the compliance controls that are relevant for my organization in that compliance profile. What's great here is I don't have to rewrite the benchmarks for my particular compliance concern, number one. And number two, because we update that content regularly and we regularly release new and better and updated content as well, you get the ability to take advantage of the content we provide, but also being able to inherit that content and customize it based on your organization's compliance standards. Right? And so tying back to all of these efficiency gains and your ability to actually execute audits in a much more efficient and automated way is your ability to be able to aggregate, normalize, and view and report on all that data, that compliance data that Chef is actually assessing across your environment. And we'll do a little bit of a demo shortly to cover this off, but essentially what we're giving you is a presentation layer to actually look at all of the things that you're assessing for compliance within your environment, whether they're nodes, APIs, et cetera. And we give you a bird's eye view of your compliance posture over a period of time. So the other thing that Dan mentioned, where audits may be pretty lumpy in terms of, okay, I perform an audit and I think that I'm in compliance, but because of the rate of change that occurs and the fact that I'm not actually running a traditional audit, my compliance gaps may be greater than I think. And so the idea is that because we're continuously evaluating the compliance posture of your systems, we can report on that data and actually show you trend data over time to show you, again, your compliance posture across your managed fleet. All right, so let's go into a little bit of the product. And if you'll give me one moment, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, terrific. So here you should be seeing the Chef Automate dashboard. And so this is where all of the data that we're collecting across your environment, so whether it's compliance data or actually your Chef configuration managed data, we're able to take all that data and aggregate it and normalize it into a single interface. And so you can see here I've got a kind of representative managed Chef fleet, and I see that I have 10 nodes that are running and everything is working really well. I can shift over, however, to the compliance tab, and I can see that I essentially have an alert showing me that my system is not compliant. And so at the top, I can drill down into the report metadata, show me the number of systems, the date of the report, its status, and then just a high-level aggregate of the platforms, environments, and profiles that I'm running. Also, a bird's eye view of the number of nodes that I'm managing, as well as the number of failures based on criticality. So we showed earlier the metadata that we can apply to a compliance profile, and here we're showing you that metadata bubbled up into those failures. You can also see here we can show you trend line, and so the idea being here is that you've got a compliance and run data, and I can see here as I roll over a mouse over the bullet points, I can basically get that summary view over time. So one of the things, and this is something that I experienced as an operator and administrator being subject to audits, one of the biggest challenges around audits is if you could show that you were compliant and how you were compliant over a period of time, the trust that you had with that auditor increased greatly. And so when there are gaps in that information or there are things that you fundamentally cannot provide, those become red flags, and auditors typically drill down deeper, and that becomes a much more painful activity and a much more time-consuming activity to actually go through. And you can see here I have aggregated the failures across different platforms as well as Chef environment-specific categorizations. Okay. So let's go ahead and drill into one of the nodes that failed. So you can see here now I've got a list of the nodes that have failed. I can see what the failures are, and then I can go in and actually look at my scan results. And you can see here I've got a couple of different compliance profiles that have been defined for this node. I have a CIS Ubuntu level 1 server, and so those are one of the premium content capabilities within the Chef Automate platform, which we provide CIS benchmarks for, again, all relevant platforms that are out there. And what I've done is I've taken that compliance profile and I've defined a superset within my particular organization's compliance to define my FFIEC compliance regime for my organization. And you can see here I can actually drill down and look at all the failures that have occurred, as well as all the controls that have passed. And I can actually even drill into each of the tests that are occurring so that I can ensure with a good degree of understanding exactly what controls have passed or failed and exactly what tests were run to actually make that test fail or pass. So you can see here I'm looking at loopback traffic. I can see the failure. There's a couple of different tests that happen for this particular control. You can see the first test actually passes, but the second pass actually fails. And so, again, granular in terms of, again, the actual control and the tests that are occurring within each control on that compliance profile. I can also see that I defined a specific FFIEC compliance requirement, and I essentially just derived one of the checks that are in the level 1 CIS profile. But I wanted to show that inheritance capability, actually show you that I can actually visually and in code separate what I take from a specific CIS benchmark and what do I define specifically for my own organization's compliance. And you can see here, I've taken this IPv6 test and essentially made it part of the FFIEC compliance profile to show that inheritance from, again, the baseline benchmark to what my organization's specific compliance regime would define. Okay? So we talked about actually, those are systems, right? So VMs, the servers, et cetera. And so Chef Automate and the Chef Compliance and InSpec really works regardless of the type of cloud provider that you work with. The other interesting part here is we also support within the Chef Automate suite the ability to actually introspect things like APIs. And so you can see here I've got an API that I'm scanning. And you can see here I'm actually looking at our solutions architecture Azure account and subscription. I can actually drill into, based on that CIS profile that I have for my Azure foundations, and I can see all of the Azure-specific compliance rules that I'm apparently not following compliance for. And you can see that these are all failed controls. And again, you can see the tests that we're running to actually check and see that those compliance rules are being passed or they're failing. Okay. So again, the ability to actually then not only introspect on actual machines, but also APIs and whatnot as well. Okay. So this is just a list of content that we provide as part of your Automate subscription, and you can see a fairly extensive list of CIS benchmarks that are included as part of that premium content. We also provide some other baselines such as DevSec, as well as application baselines such as Apache and Tomcat, MySQL, et cetera. So regardless of the type of regime that you're using as a foundation, you can incorporate all of these controls into your FFIEC specific requirements for your FinServ organization. Okay. Now we can see that we can bring all of that data up into a visualization layer that we can report on. And we can query by different indexes that are in the UI. The other thing we can do is, as part of Automate, we have integrations to systems like ServiceNow. And so the idea here is that I can actually take those compliance failures and even my Chef client failures, and I can actually generate incidents in ServiceNow based on those failures. And so you can see here I've got just a demo ServiceNow environment where I see I have a failure on one of my nodes. And you can see here, well, this is actually a converge failure. You can see that I actually went to go and run something on a node, and it actually failed. And I have context around the actual failure, and I can actually drill into the Automate server and actually look at the particular client failure as well. Well, this is an old one, so it looks like we've aged this one out. You can see I also can generate incidents based on, like I said earlier, the compliance runs. So you can see here I've got a compliance failure. And I can see here I can grab all of the context of that compliance failure in my ServiceNow dashboard, again, based on that integration that we have with ServiceNow from Chef Automate. Okay. Terrific. So part of this demo, we've highlighted your ability to operationalize Chef compliance in your environment by taking those compliance rules and those regimes that you want to automate using code and applying it to your systems and getting that aggregated, normalized view of all of that of your compliance posture across your fleet. One of the things we mentioned is because we view compliance as code. The other thing we can do is we can actually use this compliance framework to actually test for changes earlier in our process. And so just real quick here, I'm going to actually take you through an example of a cookbook that just configures an Apache page. And so this is the page that I have configured with my cookbook. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a utility called Test Kitchen. And I'm actually going to go and verify that cookbook and actually automate testing for that cookbook. So if you'll give this a moment, and I'll show you the test that I'm actually running. So as part of that cookbook, you can see I'm also using InSpec to actually define an integration test for my cookbook. And so typical workflow, especially for end user administrators, is to actually apply some type of automation and then go and log into the target host and actually manually introspect that the thing did what it was supposed to do. And with InSpec, we can actually go and automate that testing by describing those tests as code. And so because I'm just building a website, I want to make sure that I have my status equals 200 for my website. And you can see that I've effectively passed that test. What I can also do is I can also take the same compliance profiles that I've created and that I sent to my Automate server, and I can also leverage those as part of my development process as well. So those same failures or that same compliance scan that you saw in my quote-unquote production environment, I can also replicate that same compliance run on my local development environment by ensuring that I can see whether or not my local testing is going to show whether or not I'm in compliance or not. So you can see I've just enabled an additional set of tests. It's going to talk to the Automate server and pull down that compliance profile, which is that custom FFIEC compliance profile I created. I'm going to go ahead and actually rerun that test and actually show when I do that verify, I will test for the functional test, which is that I should have a 200 return code. It's actually going to go and actually assess that same environment for this particular compliance regime that I've showed you over here. So it may take a little while to run, but just really to show you that testing that you can do locally within your environment. Dan, it's always interesting. We do these, and you're always subject to the speed of light when you go through some of these tests. So it's always an interesting thing to help fill the time while we have the code running.
I'd offer to sing. I don't think that would help many people. If you want, you could jump into some of the questions that have come in. We could take a second to talk about those.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. So the first question is, how does InSpec differ from tools such as vulnerability scanners? That's actually a great question. So we talked about a little bit before around the process, and so where you're looking at, I think what I'll do is I'll just jump back to that process page, and I'll make it easier to visualize as we talk about it. In 1 second. Okay. So we talk about the traditional approaches. Typically, your vulnerability scanners are going to be at that security review gate, and so I've seen this where this may be run right before production. I've also seen this where it actually runs even after something is actually released to production. And so the challenge there is that the vulnerability scanners, while they are very comprehensive, they tend to have a lot of false positives. And so the challenge is how do you actually differentiate between what are false positive and what are actually applicable to your environment? So for example, if I actually have a requirement where I know I'm not going to be in compliance, how do I actually document that leading functions around that particular asset within my environment? So like a defense in-depth ring or whatnot. And so it's very hard using a vulnerability scanner to actually define that exception, where InSpec, again, because it's code, we give you primitives such as inheritance and exceptions to clearly identify what things are actually subject to be compliant or not, and what are some of the controls that you may want to skip because you have a waiver or a process by which you are exempt from that particular control being run on your system. The other thing that you run into is trying to do these security reviews really early on in your production or in your development cycle tend to be cost prohibitive. And because they fairly exhaustive and fairly intrusive in terms of the activity that they generate, they don't lend themselves well to incorporate them earlier into the development process. And so what we're trying to outline here is, sorry about that. What we're trying to outline here is in this workflow, the fact that I can actually test earlier on in the process using something with code that actually allows me to ensure that I have compliance really early on in my process. So I'll go back to sharing my screen.
Yeah, while you do, I'll just add to that. I think that whole story around managing these compliance policies as code, and even the things you talked through around extensibility, you were showing inheritance and customization, really being able to extend and apply to regulatory changes that that may come along by updating that code. So, in addition to the common language and some of the other things we talked about.
Yep. And so you can see here, I actually ran that compliance profile against my local development environment, and you can see it's gone through and it's actually tested for each one of those compliance rules within my environment to actually test whether or not that control passed or failed. It's a fairly exhaustive because there are a lot of controls that are part of that CIS benchmark, but you can see that you get that feedback, and you're getting that feedback really early on in that process. And so part of like your next steps here would really be to say, okay, look, what are the particular compliance rules that really apply to me as a developer or as an infracoder within this particular context, and essentially either define exceptions or assume that those are okay as part of your control failures within your environment. Again, because it's code, it's a contract between your compliance and security teams and your dev and ops teams to really understand exactly what your compliance rules and your compliance regime needs to look like. And again, because it's code, I can run it anywhere. I can run it in production after the fact, or I can run it really early on in my development process. Okay. All right, so next question is, I understand the compliance audit use case you talked about. What about other use cases you see InSpec being used for? Another great question. And so, one of the things we talked about is InSpec being compliance as code and being a compliance language and a framework. I'll go ahead and screen share again and show you a bit of those code snippets. And so you can see here, it's not too small, but you can see here, I've got a simple test that is in InSpec. I can see that actually, one second. Right. I can see that that's actually an InSpec language, and I'm actually using one of the incorporated matchers resources called HTTP and matching it to 200 other code. So I can see here, exit code, sorry. So I can see here that I'm able to test using InSpec in an automated way, and this essentially becomes part of my cookbook. We also support this kitchen InSpec for other configuration management tools as well. So you can easily automate testing your Ansible code, your Puppet code, using the kitchen InSpec driver for that platform to be able to test and automate for integration and functional tests, and also compliance tests using those configuration management tools as well. Okay. All right, next question I see is how is the tag metadata from within the control used? So the tagging metadata is, if you're used to using things like AWS and Azure and cloud environments, even Chef supports these. Tags are essentially arbitrary data points that you want to essentially assign to that particular piece of code. And so the tagging gives you a way in which to classify and categorize things that may or may not be embedded in the product. So if you saw the InSpec resource, you'll see that as a control, a title, a description, and then impact and whatnot. So those are kind of the base requirements to write the InSpec code and the compliance code against that. The tagging allows you to get more granular in terms of what those particular controls actually mean for you and your organization, and then they would be funneled up into your Automate view to be able to easily report against those types of things within your environment. See one more question. We use Chef Vault to store application passwords when using test kitchen proves to be an issue. Is there a working example that customers can follow? I believe there is. I don't have anything specific around Chef Vault for this particular demo content and webinar, but absolutely would ask that you reach out after this call or work with your team, your account team, to be able to address that particular issue and concern. But we're happy to help there as well. Okay. So bringing it home, you can see here I've got a list of security software benchmarks that we include as part of CIS. And so we listed a bunch of those that are in the Automate UI. This is just a small list of the content that we give you as part of your premium subscription. And so again, your ability to actually do things like inheritance and skip controls and whatnot actually allow you to take advantage of these benchmarks as they are. Great pattern because we update this content all the time, so you want to continue to use that content, obviously, as part of your regular updates, and also, obviously, define your organization's specific compliance regime on top of that. The other thing that we see is very interesting when we work with our customers is we actually sit down with them and work through actually assessing their environment. And so one of the ways we can help is we sit down and we actually define your current compliance posture and readiness and perform what we call a value stream discovery, and really just think of it as an assessment. But we document all the steps in your compliance process, and we really want to understand who are all the people that are involved in that process, how long does each step take, how long are you delayed for each step to actually complete before you can move on to the next one. And so this ability to actually take that current state and then actually define a future state using Chef and compliance and Chef Automate is really, really impactful. And so this is kind of an example of what we did with a particular customer where we saw their current setup for compliance. It was taking them 6+ days to actually go and actually just ensure that they were compliant across their estate. We're leveraging InSpec and Chef Automate. They were able to take that to under 2 hours from scan to review. So it's a huge, huge improvement just in the ability to actually aggregate all that reporting for an audit. And then the actual correction, obviously a Chef customer, so they're using Chef to correct, but your ability to actually take from your scans to your deployment from 5 minutes to a scan, so essentially getting that feedback and then being able to code, test, approve, and deploy within an hour. And that's a really, really powerful message when you're talking about actually detecting and correcting those violations using code, because that same code that I've used to assess my systems, I can also use to actually assess the changes that I'm making to ensure that the compliance changes, well, the actual changes I'm making to the systems are also compliant. All right, Dan, do you want to bring us home?
Yep, happy to do that. So I had laid out these financial services industry pressures at the start, and really just to kind of tie a bow on it. If you think about these issues and what we talked through with the compliance as code methodology here, risk mitigation, being able to maintain that accurate visibility on an ongoing basis, being able to take action on that really helps with some of the security issues and pressures that people are under. On the agility front, we talked a lot about, hey, regulations, whether they're becoming more arduous or whether there's deregulation in some parts of the world, it's always changing. And so being able to adapt to those changes and easily customize InSpec and what you're doing, really important aspect. The efficiency piece, again, back to those bar charts where you have one gigantic bar and one very short one when you've automated things. So just being able to free up all that time where people are pulled away from their day jobs to go work on audits. And finally, the velocity. We talked about the shift left benefits of the as code approach. So being able to deliver that software much faster when you are embedding those tests all along the life cycle. I remember we talked a lot of times in the past, people may have heard this one from us before, but there was a customer of ours that talked about applications being hung up for a year in security reviews before going into production. And I can hardly believe that's even possible. But even if you're close to that, that's extremely frustrating, and you're losing a lot of value by not being able to move things forward due to those end of process reviews. And then finally, want to just point out to everyone, there is a white paper that delves into this in some detail. So you can go to chef.io and download this white paper. It helps walk you through a few of these examples that Ricardo showed us today, where you can actually map those FFIEC controls, do the customization to the CIS benchmarks that come with Chef Automate, and adapt those to specifically align to FFIEC to help you with that, with those compliance requirements. So I think that wraps it up. And if there are any more questions, we'd be happy to answer them now.